DVD release of Flame, better known as Slade In Flame, the cautionary rock business fable made in 1975 and starring Midland's glam icon Slade, playing fictionalised versions of themselves. The directorial debut of Richard Long Crane, whose subsequent career takes in Richard III with Ian McKellen and the Harrison Ford thriller Firewall, it stands up to the ravages of time and fashion remarkably well. And the critic Mark Kermode really likes it.
Well, I've said on several occasions, and I stand by this, that Slade In Flame, or Flame, is the Citizen Kane of British rock movies. It's a really, really important, adventurous and very, very daring film that came from the most unexpected source, which is a movie made by a glam rock group whose prime audience is basically teeny boppers who are just in love with the idea of a band dressed in tinfoil, wearing reflecting hats, being jolly and bouncy and lively. And what they did in Flame was to take the story of good musicians who get bought up by a slimy investment company from London, are turned into this piece of produced pap, and then basically they just fall apart. And the bravest thing about it is that not only does it get the details right, because Slade themselves took the writer and director on tour with them to show them what life on the road was actually like, but it's brave enough to have a band like that who depend on the goodwill of those teeny boppers, taking them to the cinema and saying, you know what, it's all rubbish. And although Flame aren't Slade, they're close enough that if you were a 14-year-old Slade fan, you could come out of Flame thinking, what on earth have they done to my dream? And of course, Dave Hill thought that was what would happen.
And it did dent their commercial powers for a bit, because they'd had loads and loads of hits in a very short space of time in this country, and they sort of started to drop off after this film came out. Do you think that had anything to do with it?
Definitely, after Slade In Flame, there was a sense that perhaps the bubble had burst. Now, I don't know that it's Flame that did that to them, but I think there is a great poetic justice in a band at the peak of their sort of, pop powers, showing the audience how the trick's done, showing them what goes on behind the magician's cloak, and then there's a sort of slight wane in their success because the audience can't quite take it.
And Seymour, the Machiavellian villain played by Tom Conti,
Yeah.
he's almost a pantomime figure. He's just a man in a suit. He cares not for music. He cares not for the band. He just cares for money. This must have been quite shocking at the time.
I think it was. I mean, Noddy Holder has said that character is basically based on a version of managers, shark managers, that were more prevalent in the 60s than they were in the 70s. He remembers there was a point when literally managers and hoodlums were very, very close together, and that's one of the central ideas of Slade In Flame. Actually, what Tom Conti does with that role, he doesn't play Mr. Seymour as an evil man. He plays Mr. Seymour as a businessman who has a nice family, has a nice house. We see him reading a story to his kids at one point. It's a very sort of nice, dainty, quaint, upper-class setting, but he's just not interested in the music. And there's a lovely moment when the band are first being bought by the Seymour Trust, and Jim Lee's character says, well, do you like what we do? And he says,
my personal preference really doesn't come into it. Let me put it this way. I don't smoke cigarettes, but I managed to sell a few.
And again, it's very brave for a band in their position to represent themselves as being treated like that.
And the acting, now, that pop musicians don't make good actors is a very easy slur. Now, in this, as you've said, Slade are playing versions of themselves, but the acting's pretty naturalistic, certainly from Jimmy Lee and Noddy Holder. I think they do really, really a good job, don't you?
I think they do. There are scenes between Noddy Holder and Jim Lee together, the scene in the Pigeon Loft when they're first discussing whether or not they can get together and form a band, whether they should, sign up with the Seymour Trust. All that stuff's really, really nicely done. There's a lovely scene with Don Powell walking along the canal with his either his dad or his uncle, in which he says, well, it's no fun anymore. When we did it originally, we made a few records, that was great, but now it's all 15% merchants. And actually Don Powell, who I don't think is the greatest actor in the world, plays it very, very naturally. It's done in a long shot, and it's done very well.
Hey, you're doing all right, aren't you? It's what you wanted to do.
I don't know. It ain't the same anymore. Make a few records, that bit's okay. The rest of the time, it's a bunch of bleeding gangs in the dinner jackets. What do you do though? The whole scene's run like it.
So much has happened to the rock film, especially the British rock film, since then.
Yeah.
There's a danger, is there not, looking back on it with a kind of nostalgia for the innocence of the times, the fact that they were pushing back boundaries then, and the fact that we all now admit that we loved Slade in the first place, even though it became unfashionable to do so probably in the 80s.
Sure.
There's an element of that. Do you think that you might be overdoing it with the Citizen Kane?
Well, I'd like to say that I first said this in the 1980s. In fact, I used to tour around the country with a print of Slade In Flame, introducing it at art centres, saying, no, believe me, this is a great, great rock movie. And
That must have been a tough gig.
Well, funnily enough, I have yet to come across an audience that weren't impressed by Slade In Flame. Of course, actually, back then it was kind of easier because you could introduce it and say, no, really, trust me, it's a great movie. And then people would watch it and they'd be astonished. Now, of course, it's become accepted that Slade In Flame is a great movie. And now people say, oh, yes, of course, it's a great film and it's in the tradition of, performance and it's in the tradition of Tommy and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I kind of feel vindicated now that everyone's kind of embraced it. But there's a part of me that feels like, I said it first.